The most recent edition of Real Time with Bill Maher was incredibly controversial. Bill Maher, who was well known for his harsh stance, was swept up in what could be called a woke maelstrom of opinions. You know, those ideas that sometimes, seem to ignore reason. Indeed, those. Everything collapsed when Maher pressed his panel on the divisive topic of school closures during the outbreak.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Republicans would say that it was the teachers' union, which is very strong and democratically controlled, that made sure that the schools did not reopen.
Well,
and also that it's not the kids who were dying from it.
Right, and that's the big shame, is that the kids who were getting hurt the most by it were the ones whose parents don't have the resources to say, well, the public school's bad, let me take them out and put them in a private school. Or, sure, I can homeschool them, I have the bandwidth to do that. It was poor kids, kids of color, they're the ones who've seen the biggest learning loss as a result of all this.
Malcolm?
And the arguments, well, they really got out of hand, I must say. Not only minor disagreements, but substantial impacts on society and children's education are at stake.
I saw that today in the paper also. A lot of the students who went away during the pandemic never came back. What do you make of that?
School is good. Community education, communal education is good because you have to develop social skills. The hardest part about school is like recess and gym and all the times you have to interact with all those other little 10-year-olds. So I think it's really important for kids to be back in school.
I do too. But I mean...
Well, it can create a fiscal problem for a school too. So most schools, the way they get their funding is how many kids are enrolled. If all of a sudden your enrollment falls by 5 or 10%, your funding falls by 5 or 10%. So the fact that public schools, for so many parents, they said, I don't know if I trust this institution to educate my child anymore, it's also going to potentially make the schools worse or have to do more with less when that student funding is now gone.
And also, I mean, so you think kids should be in school. It's the Democratic Party, your party, that is blamed for that not happening during the pandemic.
Right, and it happened in Republican states and Democratic states, and all those leaders were doing the best they could with the science that was available. But there were some. Ezekiel Emanuel was a doctor who was advising Biden, was saying at the time, this is going to hurt kids. We should be really careful about closing schools. And I remember Zeke saying that. So but I don't want to bang up people who were trying to save lives when we lost 1 million people that stinking virus. We're still losing 500-600 a day.
But it was clear much earlier on than many Democratic leaders in particular.
Well, the Republicans didn't put them back in school either.
They did a lot faster, and that's.
Yeah, I mean.
But first, before we continue, have you ever wondered what it's like to challenge the existing quo?
For that not happening during the pandemic.
Right, and it happened in Republican states and Democratic states, and all those leaders were doing the best they could with the science.
Really, if you enjoy it, hit the subscribe button. I'll wait, so go ahead. Done. Welcome aboard. Now let's return inside. School closures due to pandemics. Let's go back to the heated debate that occurred on Real Time with Bill Maher. As was to be expected, Bill Maher began by addressing the glaring issue, the consequences of pandemic school closures. Now, Maher has never hesitated to tackle topics that some people may consider too controversial to bring up. This time, his primary focus was on the detrimental effects that these closures have had on underprivileged students. You know, the ones who probably suffer the most whenever the decision-makers play their political games. However, his panelists seemed to be stuck in a never-ending loop of cliched justifications. They invoked the science as though it were sacred text that backed up every decision made throughout the pandemic. The story was getting tired, let's face it. The science was complex, to say the least. It was like watching a person try to use a house of cards to prove a point. How often have we heard the phrase, "We did the best we could with the science"? Isn't that a little too many? Further research revealed that Maher rejected the arguments put out by both Democratic and Republican states to close schools. His goal was to demonstrate how political ties shaped initiatives that had varying degrees of success, if any could be deemed successes at all, rather than to condemn the Democrats in particular. For instance, states like Florida took a different approach and reopened their schools sooner than many Democratic bastions. One of the challenging questions Maher was raising was, were the decisions made truly for the welfare of the children, or was it all a political maneuver? When it comes to the details, Maher was critiquing not only the inflexible ideological boundaries but also the ostensibly helpful machinery that supported these decisions. The unions, the bureaucratic maze that seemed more focused on promoting its own ideology than on coming up with workable answers.
Everything you said is valid. All that is an issue. This seemed to be just 5 cops who wanted to wail on a guy for no apparent reason. If that kid had been white, would they have not done that?
No, they wouldn't have. Period. We all know that.
So 5 black.
I mean, there is a color issue within law enforcement altogether.
Even among black cops.
Yeah, because they're cops.
Because they're cops.
This is a mindset. Same way we have in the military. We have a mindset, right? I think policing now has moved so far away from community service towards self-preservation. They go to courses like the On Killing program on how to do self-preservation, how to battle like a special forces soldier. What they need to do is they need to start thinking more along the old beat cop, protecting the community by knowing the community and not seeing. I don't understand it, right? I'm a big guns guy. Not every black man is the one who has the firearm, right? They assume this block is all armed. Maybe that's because some of them are. But I'm going to tell you, there is a large proportion of the white population in the United States who routinely carry guns openly, brazenly, have stickers on their cars, and cops just say, oh, these are the kind of guys that I go to range with. Good job. Kyle Rittenhouse, for example. Right? They gave through him water that night. If I had been out on the street with a long rifle like that, they would have been throwing lead down there, freedom bullets.
He talked on how teachers' unions had the ability to make decisions and could have postponed the reopening of schools despite mounting evidence of the severe long-term disadvantages that students experienced, especially in districts under Democratic leadership. Impact on the community. Then there is the vocal opposition to the unjust outcomes that children face, which disproportionately impact communities of color. Here, Maher was furious. We're talking about real lives and futures, after all. Children who were once on the correct track were suddenly rerouted only because they had the luxury of private education or homeschooling, which more affluent families might have more easily accessed. This led Maher to question if the protracted school closures were being implemented for the right reasons. Were the risks thoroughly considered? Has anyone listened to the opinions of those who were most affected? And it was amazing how much blame was thrown around. Maher's indignation was strong, and he called on the audience to investigate the purported science that was preventing children from returning to schools that are crucial to their social and academic growth. Reactions that display hypocrisy. It got even worse at this point, isn't it? Maher was essentially attacking what he perceived to be hypocrisy in the context of the often cited saving lives argument. By avoiding the harsh, disturbing reality that closures might not have been the only solution, this admirable passion seemed to be used to suppress criticism. Maher also talked endlessly on accountability, or rather, how it is conspicuously lacking. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all scenario, but Maher's focus on the imbalance the pandemic exacerbated and the flagrant rejection of alternative scientific opinions created an atmosphere that was conducive to annoyance. His visitors were struggling under the spotlight, and their defenses quickly devolved into vague statements about doing what was needed. He never allowed his dissatisfaction to simmer under the surface. Rather, Maher made it worse. He challenged them, and really all of us, to consider if the strong truly gained anything from this catastrophe. Unfairness in the system. This is a fascinating twist. Maher used this similar enthusiasm to fuel discussions about structural injustices and police enforcement that were prompted by previous events and trials. Maher looked at how racial biases affect decisions made by the government and law enforcement, much like how politics usually overlooks the marginalized. He was curious as to why, despite several examples of excessive use of force by law enforcement, people kept using flimsy excuses to defend faulty systems. He was frank in his criticism, especially when it came to recent controversial police tactics. By this point, Maher's transition from suspicion to open disbelief probably mirrored the emotions that many of us experience when we witness the same disturbing tales reappear under other identities. Maher didn't keep quiet about it, and it was a sign of a bigger social issue. How the very systems we depend on keep failing the weak when they are subjected to structural inequalities.
If Tyree Nichols had been white, would we be seeing a different response?
I'm afraid to say that we would have. I mean, I think that we would have had a slow walk of the indictments. But the issue here isn't about the color of the policeman. The issue is that the tactics, techniques, procedures, and training of these law enforcement officers on these special teams. Way back when I went through a SWAT officer's course with Capitol Hill Police and some other police forces that were there to learn how to be SWAT cops. The techniques that we were shown back then were not always guns forward, guns all the time. Now the average police officer is trained to believe that he's, number one job is to come home at night. I agree with that 1,000%. But there are jobs there are things there that are just clearly require an intervention that does not require you to draw your weapon.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't, that certainly.
Do we benefit from these systems, or are we merely pawns in their automated efficiency and self-serving agenda? He asked his panel and the audience again. Through the screen, Bill Maher's comments and outrage could be heard by everyone who was prepared to listen, not just the people in his studio. While these intense arguments simmered with emotion, he bridled the gap between criticism and collective action, forcing us to think critically and assess exactly where our ideological allegiances lay. Were Maher's arguments a biting critique of a wealthy and distant elite? Perhaps, but there was a calling to elevate the discussion above mere disillusionment. Or possibly helping us understand why it matters and taking action when judgments are clouded by dogma rather than empathy or reason. Discussion and self-reflection. What do you think? Do you agree with Maher's overall viewpoint on the issue? Or maybe you see things differently? Please share your opinions in the comments section. I'd love to hear what you think of all of this. Let's carry on this conversation.